Sheila Bellush was a 35-year-old woman living in Sarasota, Florida at the time of her death in 1997. She was the mother of 6 children, including a set of quadruplets, and was described by those who knew her as a devoted parent and committed spouse. Sheila had relocated from Texas to Florida with her second husband, Jamie Bellush, in an effort to build a quieter, more secure life for her growing family. But it wasn't that simple. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Sheila was originally from the San Antonio area. Her first marriage to Blackthorne produced 2 daughters, and for a time they lived in a comfortable suburban setting. However, as the marriage deteriorated, allegations of emotional abuse surfaced. The couple eventually divorced, but the legal battles over custody of their children continued long after. Sheila was granted primary custody, but the situation remained adversarial. Court documents later revealed that the relationship between Sheila and Blackthorne remained strained for years, with multiple filings and custody hearings that kept them connected through legal channels, even as their personal lives moved in different directions. Sheila met her second husband, Jamie Bellush, after her divorce. Together, they built a life focused on stability and family. Their home in Sarasota was modest, but filled with the activity and energy typical of a large household. Sheila gave birth to quadruplets, 2 boys and 2 girls, which increased the family's profile in the local community. Managing a household with 6 children required organization, patience, and emotional strength. Friends and neighbors often remarked on Sheila's ability to maintain calm under pressure and prioritize the well-being of her children above all else. Despite the geographic separation from Texas, there were signs that Sheila still felt uneasy about her past. She took certain precautions regarding her family's routine, and friends noted that she preferred to keep a low profile. The fact that she had sole custody of her daughters meant that her legal relationship with her ex-husband was ongoing. Though there were no immediate threats reported to authorities in Florida, there remained an underlying concern about how unresolved tensions from the past might resurface. Sheila was not someone who sought attention. Her daily life was centered around her children's needs, managing school runs, preparing meals, and creating a safe home environment. She rarely traveled and kept a close circle of trusted friends. Those who knew her described her as private but friendly, cautious but not paranoid. Her husband worked in sales, and together, they appeared to be moving forward with their lives, a blended family overcoming adversity with quiet determination. In the months leading up to her death, there was no indication that Sheila was in immediate danger. There were no reported threats, no confrontations, and no unusual behavior that alarmed those around her. She lived in a peaceful neighborhood in Sarasota, where violent crime was rare and residents generally felt safe. Yet, unknown to her, a plot had been forming hundreds of miles away. A plan that would shatter the illusion of safety and bring devastating consequences to a woman who had already endured more than most. Though Sheila had successfully removed herself from the direct orbit of her former life, some connections cannot be entirely severed, especially when custody, control, and resentment remain unresolved. As will become evident in the next section, what happened in her home on November 7, 1997, would not be a random act of violence. It would be the culmination of years of anger, legal disputes, and an orchestrated decision by someone who refused to let her live her life in peace. On the afternoon of November 7, 1997, in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Sarasota, Florida, a 13-year-old girl arrived home from school expecting a routine afternoon. The teenager, the eldest child from Sheila Bellush's previous marriage, was used to entering a home full of noise, toddlers playing, her mother bustling in the kitchen, the sounds of a household in motion. But that day, something was different. The front door was slightly ajar. There was no movement, no sound. No one greeted her. What she found instead would alter the course of her life and ignite a national investigation. As she entered the house, calling out for her mother, there was no reply. The silence was immediate and overwhelming. She stepped deeper inside and found the family's quadruplets, just 2 years old, alone and crying. They were in their diapers, smeared with what initially looked like food or paint. They appeared disoriented, confused, and frightened. She quickly realized it was blood. Her instincts turned to panic. She looked for Sheila, but every room she checked offered only more silence, more unease. Eventually, in one of the rooms, she found her mother. Sheila was lying on the floor, motionless. There were visible injuries. There was blood. The scene was horrifying. The girl ran to the phone and dialed 911. The emergency call was placed at 1:30 p.m. When paramedics and sheriff's deputies arrived, they found the children unharmed physically but covered in blood, likely from crawling near or on their mother's body after the incident. They were immediately removed from the scene for their safety and examined. The residence was cordoned off. Investigators quickly confirmed what the teenage daughter had already feared. Sheila Bellush was dead. She had been shot in the face at close range. There were signs that she had been physically restrained before being killed. Officers and paramedics noted a deliberate, cold execution. No struggle around the room, no chaos, just efficient violence. The house bore no signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no shattered windows. Nothing suggested a burglary gone wrong. Sheila's jewelry and personal items were untouched. Her purse was where she usually kept it. There were no missing electronics, no signs of ransacking. It didn't look like a robbery. It looked like a planned, intentional killing. This changed the profile of the case immediately. Investigators were no longer treating it as a possible home invasion. From the beginning, it was labeled what it appeared to be: a targeted execution of a mother in her own home, in the middle of the day, while 4 toddlers were present. Forensic units began documenting every aspect of the crime scene. Technicians photographed the body, the location, the children, and anything that appeared out of place. They swabbed for blood, lifted prints, and searched for shell casings or signs of entry or exit. The initial autopsy would later confirm that Sheila had been shot execution style, the bullet entering at close range. Medical experts noted ligature marks on her wrists, indicating she had likely been restrained before the fatal shot. It appeared she had been forced into submission and then killed. There were no signs of sexual assault. The nature of the wounds and the condition of the scene pointed to a methodical and fast execution. It had taken just minutes. The assailant had known what they were doing. As officers canvassed the neighborhood, they quickly determined that no one had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. The crime had occurred between 11 a.m. and 12:30 p.m., a narrow time window. Her husband, Jamie Bellush, was ruled out almost immediately. He had been at work with multiple witnesses confirming his whereabouts. The older children were at school. That left Sheila and the quadruplets alone in the home during that period. Whoever had come to the door knew that. They knew her routine. They knew when she would be alone. The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office began analyzing call logs, phone records, and recent contact history. They found no immediate threats. Sheila had not mentioned being followed or harassed, but the location, the precision of the attack, and the total absence of theft or other motive suggested a chilling conclusion. This had not been spontaneous. It had been planned. One officer later described the scene as eerily clean, despite the presence of blood and trauma. There was no overturned furniture, no broken glass. It was as though someone had walked in, neutralized the victim, and walked out. The weapon had not been found. There were no fingerprints left behind. Investigators believed the assailant had worn gloves. Nothing in the home gave away a motive. The fact that the children had not been harmed further indicated something specific. The killer had come for Sheila, and only Sheila. That detail troubled the detectives. It was a message, perhaps, a hit. And if it was, the next question became, who would want her dead? By the next morning, the media had caught wind of the story. Headlines framed it as a mysterious murder in a quiet neighborhood. A mother of 6, executed in her home. The image was stark. And then came the second detail that drew national attention: the quadruplets. The idea that 4 infants had been in the home, possibly witnessing the aftermath, escalated the emotional weight of the story. Law enforcement brought in state and federal assistance. The FBI offered support. They started analyzing traffic cameras, witness tips, and vehicle logs. Surveillance footage from nearby roads and intersections was gathered and reviewed. Within days, a neighbor mentioned seeing a car with out-of-state plates in the neighborhood earlier that day. Investigators cross-checked the description with Florida DMV records and began to develop a new angle. Someone had traveled to Sarasota for this. It wasn't random. Sheila's past, once seemingly behind her, now moved into the foreground of the investigation. As they dug deeper, detectives uncovered that Sheila had recently relocated to Florida from Texas. Her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne, still lived in San Antonio. Their past had been contentious. Custody battles, restraining orders, legal motions. Sheila had moved across the country in part to escape the turbulence and fear associated with that relationship. That's when the case shifted from a local homicide to something else. A planned, coordinated act carried out across state lines. And now, the investigation would expand beyond Florida, beyond state borders, and eventually, beyond the country. As investigators began digging deeper into Sheila Bellush's life, one name quickly surfaced again and again: Alan Blackthorne. He was Sheila's ex-husband, a wealthy businessman from Texas and the father of her two eldest children. On the surface, their separation appeared typical of contentious custody disputes. But those who knew the couple well understood that their relationship had been filled with tension, court battles, and years of unresolved anger. Sheila and Blackthorne had divorced years earlier, and custody of their children had been fiercely contested. Multiple legal motions, restraining orders, and allegations of abuse had characterized their post-marital history. Eventually, Sheila had been granted full custody of the children, and, as a protective measure, relocated from Texas to Florida with her new husband, Jamie Bellush, in hopes of putting distance, both emotional and geographic, between herself and her former spouse. Blackthorne, however, had not let go. Records from court documents revealed that he continued to challenge Sheila in legal proceedings, often under the pretense of concern for their daughters. Witnesses later told investigators that he was obsessed with regaining control, particularly over the children. While he had not been physically near Sheila in years, his name remained a looming presence in her life, and she had allegedly voiced concerns to family and friends about his unpredictable nature. In the days following Sheila's murder, detectives began mapping out her personal connections. As they reviewed her legal history, financial records, and social ties, it became evident that the most contentious chapter of her life had been her battle with Blackthorne. What had initially seemed like a tragic home invasion or a domestic dispute now appeared to have a deeper, more deliberate motive. Investigators discovered that Blackthorne had access to significant financial resources, which allowed him to operate without obvious suspicion. He lived in a gated community, maintained a clean public image, and had no known direct connection to the Sarasota area. However, what raised suspicion was a set of communications that tied him, albeit indirectly, to individuals who might have had knowledge of or involvement in Sheila's death. One of the first breakthroughs came when authorities interviewed Daniel Rocha, a man with a history of minor criminal offenses who was known to have connections to Blackthorne. Rocha, under questioning, eventually admitted that he had been approached by Blackthorne in the months prior to Sheila's death. According to Rocha, the conversation had been vague but suggestive. Blackthorne had expressed a strong desire to know Sheila's location and movements and had hinted at wanting her out of the way. This admission led detectives to begin examining Blackthorne's financial transactions. They found evidence of large cash withdrawals, unaccounted travel, and connections to known intermediaries. As the investigative net widened, another name emerged: Samuel Gonzalez, a man who had reportedly served as a go-between, linking Rocha to an individual named Jose Luis Del Toro Jr., the man who would later be accused of carrying out the actual murder. Del Toro, a 21-year-old bodybuilder from Texas, had no known personal connection to Sheila, but had received money through Rocha and Gonzalez. Authorities began to trace his movements leading up to the date of the murder. Phone records, hotel receipts, and witness accounts eventually placed Del Toro in Florida at the time of the crime. Surveillance footage from nearby stores and gas stations provided further circumstantial evidence. The challenge for prosecutors was clear, proving that a wealthy, seemingly removed man in Texas had orchestrated the murder of his ex-wife hundreds of miles away through a chain of intermediaries. It would require time, cooperation, and piecing together a trail of indirect evidence that, while compelling, had to hold up in court. Blackthorne, meanwhile, denied any involvement. Through his attorneys, he claimed no knowledge of the individuals under investigation and expressed sympathy for Sheila's family. Publicly, he remained calm, issuing statements that emphasized his concern for his daughters and decried the media's portrayal of him as a suspect. Behind the scenes, however, law enforcement agents were steadily building a case, one that would eventually reach across state lines and international borders. As this section of the investigation progressed, it became clear that Sheila's murder had not been a random act of violence. It had been a targeted killing, carried out with planning and intention. The question now was whether prosecutors could prove that the man at the top of that chain, the one who had once vowed to take Sheila to court until she's destroyed, had finally acted on that threat. And if so, whether justice would follow him all the way from Texas to Florida and beyond. As detectives scrambled to secure the scene of Sheila Bellush's murder and gather evidence, another race began. One not just for justice, but for time. Within hours of the crime, authorities realized the most critical figure in the case, Jose Luis del Toro Jr., was no longer anywhere near Sarasota, Florida. The man who was suspected of pulling the trigger had effectively disappeared. Investigators acted quickly to reconstruct his movements, and early signs pointed to a deliberate, premeditated escape. Surveillance footage, toll booth logs, gas station receipts, and ATM withdrawal records traced Del Toro's route away from Florida. He had driven through several states, traveling by vehicle with a clear intent to avoid detection. His route skirted major cities and stuck to corridors with fewer surveillance cameras. There was no sign of panic in his movement. It appeared organized and calculated. Del Toro had not simply fled in the heat of the moment. Law enforcement soon discovered that preparations for his escape had likely been made well before the crime occurred. Cell phone records and financial transactions indicated that he had withdrawn large amounts of cash in the days leading up to the murder. Communications recovered from his device, and from other persons of interest, suggested that Del Toro had been in contact with intermediaries who may have arranged parts of his escape. These intermediaries had links not only to his associate Daniel Rocha, but also, as later alleged in court, to Alan Blackthorne, the ex-husband of Sheila Bellush. These findings shifted the perception of the case. It was no longer just a shocking homicide. It began to look like a premeditated plot, with multiple actors and strategic intent. Authorities confirmed that Del Toro had successfully crossed the US-Mexico border within days of the crime. Once in Mexico, he changed tactics, shifting from overland travel to discreet movements between smaller towns. American law enforcement issued a nationwide alert, followed by an international request for cooperation through Interpol. The case transitioned from a local investigation to a full-fledged international manhunt. Mexican authorities were alerted, and US officials began preparing formal extradition documents. Del Toro, meanwhile, had already moved again, this time into Central America. Reports surfaced that a man matching his description had been seen in Nicaragua. He was allegedly using a false name, blending in with local populations, and avoiding cities with high concentrations of foreign visitors. Multiple tips came in from coastal towns. Witnesses described a man who fit Del Toro's description working under the table jobs and living with individuals believed to be sympathetic or paid to help. American authorities, working alongside the FBI, the U.S. Marshals Service, and the State Department, made contact with Nicaraguan officials. The two governments began the process of diplomatic engagement. Despite formal treaties between the countries, extradition was far from straightforward. Nicaragua had strict legal frameworks that required compelling documentation, judicial review, and legal assurances, particularly on sentencing. By now, Del Toro had been placed on Interpol's Red Notice list, effectively marking him as a wanted international fugitive. As U.S. diplomatic channels were engaged, intelligence sharing increased. Surveillance narrowed in on a small coastal village. Local police, informed by U.S. operatives and supported by Nicaraguan national security agents, executed a controlled operation. Del Toro was arrested without incident. He was found to be carrying forged documents, including a counterfeit passport and local identification papers. His arrest marked a turning point. It showed that even a well-executed escape plan could not outrun international cooperation and persistence. However, capturing Del Toro was only part of the battle. Bringing him back to the United States would take many more months. Nicaraguan law required extensive review of all extradition materials. Del Toro's defense team, comprised of local and international lawyers, filed multiple appeals to prevent his return. They argued that he might face an unfair trial or be subjected to penalties incompatible with Nicaraguan human rights standards. Specifically, they cited the possibility of capital punishment, which had been abolished in Nicaragua. This led to an important legal condition. U.S. authorities were required to formally agree not to seek the death penalty in order to proceed with the extradition. Prosecutors in Texas, where Del Toro would eventually be tried, agreed to these terms. The extradition request was finalized. Del Toro remained in custody in Nicaragua under high security until all appeals were exhausted. Throughout this period, Sheila Bellush's family waited. They issued public statements urging continued pressure, attended media interviews, and rallied public support to keep the case in focus. Their message was consistent. They wanted accountability, and they did not want the case to fade into silence. The media followed the story closely. Coverage spanned not only U.S. outlets, but international networks, particularly in Latin America. Journalists traced Del Toro's flight route, interviewed Nicaraguan locals, and reported on the diplomatic negotiations taking place behind closed doors. Advocacy groups, especially those supporting victims of violent crime, issued statements calling for greater cross-border cooperation in cases of planned homicide. The case began to set a precedent, not just in law enforcement circles, but also in public discourse about how justice could be pursued across borders when crime was deliberate, violent, and meticulously planned. Eventually, with all legal barriers addressed, Del Toro was extradited. He was flown under U.S. Marshal escort back to the United States. Upon arrival, he was transferred to a secure facility and placed in custody pending trial. His return marked more than a successful capture. It enabled prosecutors to pursue not only individual charges against Del Toro, but also broader questions about coordination, motive, and the involvement of others. With Del Toro in custody, authorities now hoped that pressure could be applied to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy behind Sheila Bellush's murder. His arrest was not the end of the case, but it represented a decisive step forward in the pursuit of accountability. After José Luis Del Toro Jr. was taken into custody in Nicaragua, the criminal proceedings entered a new, diplomatically complex phase. Del Toro, a U.S. citizen arrested in a foreign country for a violent crime committed in the United States, now became the center of both legal and political negotiations. His capture marked a temporary victory, but it was only the beginning of a lengthy extradition process that would test the cooperation between two justice systems and highlight the bureaucratic and legal challenges of prosecuting crimes that cross international borders. Nicaraguan authorities held Del Toro under strict security in a detention facility outside of Managua. Given the nature of the charges against him, first-degree murder and conspiracy, local officials treated him as a high-profile detainee. He was initially booked under immigration violations due to possession of falsified documents, but once his identity was verified, Nicaraguan prosecutors opened a preliminary case to evaluate the extradition request filed by the U.S. Department of Justice. Extradition proceedings, however, are not automatic. Nicaragua, like many nations, exercises legal scrutiny over such requests and has its own process for determining whether a suspect should be transferred to another jurisdiction for trial. Del Toro's defense attorneys, working with local counsel, argued that their client's extradition should be denied, or at minimum, delayed. They cited constitutional protections under Nicaraguan law, concerns about due process in the U.S., and the potential for Del Toro to face a life sentence under harsh conditions. Their primary legal strategy revolved around the stipulation that Nicaragua, having abolished capital punishment, would not extradite an individual to a country where the death penalty could be applied. This led to intense diplomatic back and forth. U.S. prosecutors provided written assurances that Del Toro would not face capital punishment if returned to American soil. These assurances were critical in moving the process forward. For Sheila Bellush's family, the drawn-out nature of the extradition hearings was excruciating. The case had already received extensive media coverage in the U.S., and now, every delay was another reminder of how justice remained just out of reach. Advocacy groups, especially those focused on cross-border crime and victims' rights, began amplifying the case in international forums. Their efforts brought attention to the broader issue of fugitives escaping to countries with different legal systems, and the need for more efficient mechanisms for cross-national cooperation. It took several months for the Nicaraguan court to approve the extradition. During this period, Del Toro remained largely uncooperative with authorities. According to reports, He declined multiple interviews and invoked his right to remain silent. While he did not openly contest his identity or deny his arrest, he avoided any statements that might connect him directly to the events in Sarasota, Florida. In the meantime, U.S. law enforcement prepared for his return. Arrangements were made for secure transport, including coordination between Nicaraguan authorities, U.S. Marshals, and diplomatic escorts to ensure there would be no opportunity for escape or interference. Upon arrival in the United States, Del Toro was taken into federal custody and transported to Texas to face charges related to the murder of Sheila Bellush. Although the crime had occurred in Florida, the initial phase of prosecution would take place in Texas due to legal jurisdiction over elements of the conspiracy, particularly involving individuals believed to have coordinated from Texas. Once in the U.S., Del Toro was formally charged with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and use of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Prosecutors moved quickly to establish a timeline, present forensic evidence, and identify connections between Del Toro and other persons of interest, especially Daniel Rocha and Alan Blackthorne. Del Toro's legal team opted to enter into plea negotiations with prosecutors. They understood that the evidence against him, including witness testimony, digital trails, surveillance footage, and ballistics, would likely lead to a conviction. In exchange for a reduced sentence and potential protection during incarceration, Del Toro agreed to provide limited testimony regarding his involvement and the roles of other individuals. However, this cooperation came with restrictions. Del Toro was careful in his wording, often avoiding direct implications of Blackthorne's intent, focusing instead on Rocha's involvement as the intermediary. The court proceedings were closely followed by the media and the public. Sheila Bellush's family was present at each hearing, often accompanied by victim advocates. The courtroom atmosphere remained somber and tense. Del Toro, during his court appearances, showed little emotion. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged the impact of the crime on the Bellush family, noting that the murder had not only taken the life of a mother of 6, but had also traumatized young children who were present in the home at the time of the killing. Del Toro was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected both the premeditated nature of the crime and the devastating emotional harm caused by its execution. But for prosecutors and investigators, the conviction of Del Toro was just one part of a larger puzzle. The question remained, who had commissioned the murder, and how deep did the conspiracy go? The legal focus now shifted. With Del Toro in prison, investigators were able to revisit communications, banking records, and previous testimonies to further solidify the link between Daniel Rocha and Alan Blackthorne. The case against the alleged mastermind of the murder-for-hire plot was building. Del Toro's conviction created the legal momentum necessary to bring the others to trial. What started as a murder case in Sarasota had become a far-reaching criminal conspiracy crossing state and national lines, and the next chapter was just beginning. As the case against José Luis Del Toro Jr. progressed, investigators began to widen their scope. While Del Toro had pulled the trigger, law enforcement had long suspected he had not acted alone, nor come up with the idea of murder independently. As early as the first week of the investigation, attention turned toward the individuals who might have coordinated, financed, or otherwise encouraged the attack on Sheila Bellush. At the center of that suspicion was Alan Blackthorne, Sheila's ex-husband. Blackthorne lived in San Antonio, Texas, and had established himself as a successful businessman in the electronics industry. Outwardly, he appeared affluent and respected, but to those closer to the case, particularly Sheila's family and longtime friends, his name triggered concern. Their past relationship had not ended amicably. In fact, it had been the source of years of legal battles, custody disputes, and troubling behavior. Sheila and Alan had divorced years before the murder, and she had relocated to Florida with her children, largely to escape continued conflict. Despite this physical distance, Blackthorne had remained involved in legal disputes over their children. Court documents from prior years revealed a pattern of contentious litigation. More concerningly, some filings included allegations of stalking, intimidation, and attempts to manipulate custody outcomes. What began to emerge was a picture of a man deeply invested in controlling outcomes in his personal life, especially when those outcomes involved his ex-wife and their children. It was this history that drew the attention of federal investigators. They began to reconstruct communications between Blackthorne and known associates in Texas, including Daniel Alex Rocha, a man with a criminal history and connections to Del Toro. Phone records, financial transactions, and eyewitness interviews began to outline a possible chain of involvement. Prosecutors believed that Blackthorne had spoken to Rocha on multiple occasions in the weeks leading up to the murder. These conversations coincided with movements made by Del Toro, including his drive from Texas to Florida. It was suspected that Rocha had been acting as an intermediary, someone who could put Blackthorne's desires into motion without direct contact between the businessman and the eventual shooter. One of the challenges for investigators was proving intent and direct involvement without clear, recorded conversations or a paper trail explicitly laying out the murder-for-hire scheme. The communications were often vague, sometimes encoded in casual or indirect language. However, circumstantial evidence began to build. Cash withdrawals, phone records showing timing that aligned with planning stages, and corroborating testimony from individuals who interacted with Rocha or Del Toro during this period. Federal agents also investigated Blackthorne's past for patterns of coercive behavior. Interviews with former employees and acquaintances painted a complex picture. Some described him as driven and aggressive. Others hinted at controlling tendencies, especially in personal relationships. All of this contributed to an emerging theory: that Blackthorne, unwilling to let go of past resentments or lose custody leverage, had decided to eliminate Sheila, not through direct action, but through a layered conspiracy. As evidence mounted, a federal grand jury was convened. The prosecutors presented the chain of events, including Del Toro's arrest in Nicaragua, Rocha's alleged role as a facilitator, and Blackthorne's communications and financial activities. The argument was that Blackthorne had orchestrated the murder through intermediaries, maintaining plausible deniability, but ultimately serving as the initiator. Eventually, the grand jury returned an indictment. Alan Blackthorne was charged with interstate conspiracy to commit murder and interstate domestic violence resulting in death. The charges allowed federal jurisdiction due to the nature of the interstate elements, specifically, the movement of individuals across state lines to commit a violent act, and the use of communication tools to facilitate that crime. Blackthorne was arrested in Texas and denied the allegations. Through legal counsel, he maintained that he had no role in Sheila's death and that he had not instructed anyone to harm her. His defense claimed that any communications with Rocha were unrelated to any criminal enterprise and that any past legal disputes with Sheila were standard custody disagreements, not motive for murder. However, prosecutors argued otherwise. They brought forward witness testimony suggesting that Blackthorne had expressed deep anger toward Sheila in the months prior. They cited calls in which Rocha allegedly discussed fixing the Sheila problem, and they pointed to financial records that showed large sums of money moving between accounts connected to Rocha. The trial attracted widespread media attention. Sheila Bellush had been a devoted mother of 6, including quadruplets. Her violent death in the presence of her children horrified the public. The proceedings were closely followed by advocacy groups focused on domestic violence and family court reform. In the courtroom, the prosecution presented a structured timeline, detailing how Blackthorne's communications aligned with Rocha's coordination of Del Toro. Witnesses included friends of the victim, FBI agents, forensic analysts, and individuals familiar with the relationships between all parties. Defense attorneys attempted to discredit these narratives, suggesting that Rocha had acted independently and that Del Toro's motives were unclear. Ultimately, the jury found the circumstantial and testimonial evidence compelling. Blackthorne was convicted on multiple federal charges, including orchestrating a murder-for-hire plot that resulted in the death of his ex-wife. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. This conviction marked the conclusion of a years-long legal battle that crossed state and national borders. It confirmed what Sheila's family had long suspected, that her death was not random, but the result of a calculated plan carried out through a network of individuals. Alan Blackthorne, once a respected businessman, became a symbol of how domestic violence can escalate beyond control when combined with power, wealth, and a refusal to let go.